welcome, and thank you for joining us for the second panel in the Why Arts Matter series. This series is an ongoing conversation about the essential role of the arts in offering critical perspectives, creativity, and diverse ways of knowing that enrich how we understand ourselves, society, and the world. The arts, be it history, philosophy, languages, fine arts, theatre, or music, aren't separate from the sciences or other disciplines, but deeply interconnected, contributing to the ways we navigate global challenges, social life, and individual experience. It feels especially fitting to gather in the Improv Lab today, this beautiful space that we're in. It's a space designed for creative exploration, collaboration, and experimentation. It's a place where ideas come to life, where dialogue sparks innovation, and where the impact of the arts can be felt in real time. It's also very important to recognize that this space and the University of Guelph reside on the ancestral lands of the Atawandron and the Haudenosaunee people, and the treaty lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit. We uphold the significance of the Dish with One Spoon covenant and the continuing relationship our Indigenous neighbors have with this land. We recognize that today this gathering place is home to many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples, and acknowledging them reminds us of our relationships to this land where we learn and work. We commit to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to actions. We must do more to learn, share, and support truth and healing. So our goal with Why Arts Matter is to bring together researchers, artists, and community voices to explore the intersections of disciplines and open conversations that reach far beyond the university. Through this series, we celebrate the power of the arts to connect, challenge, and inspire. We're so pleased to continue this dialogue with you today in exploring the topic Power in Representation with our panelists, Amanda Boetzkes, John Russon, and Gaby-Trotz. For now, I'm going to introduce our panelists. So first of all, I'm delighted to introduce Amanda Boetzkes. Dr. Boetzkes is Research Leadership Chair and Professor of Contemporary Art History and Theory in the School of Languages and Literatures at the University of Guelph. She's the author of Plastic Capitalism, Contemporary Art and the Drive to Waste, The Ethics of Earth Art, and a forthcoming book titled Ecologicity, Vision and the Planetarity of Art. Her edited books include Art's Realism in the Post-Truth Era, Artworks for Jellyfish, and others. You have the greatest book titles. And, well, apart from this one, Heidegger and the Work of Art History. Her research, lectures, and critical writing are concerned with the relationship between perception and representation, theories of consciousness, and ecology. She's analyzed the complex expressions and interpretations of ecosystems, the human and more than human sites of aesthetic exchange, focusing on patterns of human waste, the global energy economy, necropolitics, extinction, and decolonial arts. Very, very cool. Her current project, At the Moraine, considers modes of visualizing environments with a special focus on the indigenous territories of the circumpolar north. John Russon, pleasure to have you here. John Russon is a professor in the philosophy department at the University of Guelph, where he's been teaching since 2003. Before coming to Guelph, he taught at a number of different universities in the US and Canada, as well as doing 2 years of postdoctoral research in the classics department at Harvard University. He is the author of 8 books. He's a prolific author, most notably a trilogy of very well-received books about human development. The first, Human Experience, in 2003, and then Bearing Witness to Epiphany in 2009, and Adult Life in 2020. He's currently completing his 9th book, entitled To Live in These Times, in which he analyzes the negative dimensions of various technological developments that shape modern culture, especially central banking, digital computers, and the centralized nation state, and considers how the resources of contemporary artwork can function as a corrective to this technological perspective. Sounds very, very timely. So the title again, To Live in These Times, look out for it. And our third panelist, Gaby-Trotz. Gaby-Trotz is a printmaker and photographer whose work critically explores social issues, identity, and the natural environment. With an MFA in printmaking from the University of Alberta, her practice centers on the transformative power of art, particularly in creating inclusive spaces for marginalized communities. Anna has worked on significant community projects, such as Be Our Ally with Sheater, addressing homophobia among rural youth. She also founded the Queer Print Club at the University of Guelph, where she teaches screen printing and fosters a supportive, creative environment for queer artists. From 2015 to 2021, Anna served as technical director at Open Studio in Toronto, where she initiated the North-South Printmaking Residency with the West Baffin Eskimo Cooperative, and has overseen numerous creative projects with national and international artists. She's collaborated with artists including Tim Pitsiulak and, Ningukulu TV. Was that, is that close enough? All right, thank you very much. Recently printing several projects in collaboration with Namara Projects and the West Baffin Eskimo Cooperative. Her recent print-based work, Baseline, examines themes of the climate emergency and how each generation gets progressively more used to our current climate. And she's currently working on a show with fellow artist Rochelle Forsey called The Landscape is Dead, which will be featured in this year's upcoming Kafka 2025 Biennale. And this show examines the tenuous balance of hope and despair in our current climate crisis. So glad that you're here. Very, very impressive panel. I'm looking forward to the conversation. I'm just going to talk a little bit more just to introduce the topic, and then I'm going to turn it over to you guys. So our topic for today, Why Arts Matter, is power in representation. So I'm going to ask the panel to investigate how contemporary art engages with pressing social and environmental issues, challenging traditional notions of authority and representation. The discussion is going to explore the intersections of artistic practices with the life sciences and global energy systems, highlighting how art can serve as a platform for critical inquiry into value, perception, and consciousness. Participants will examine contemporary norms around the body and social relations, as well as foundations of culture. As if that wasn't enough, it says here. Additionally, the platform will address how art can illuminate personal identity and our meaningful interactions with the world around us, inviting a deeper understanding of realism that transcends authoritative frameworks. So, without more ado, I'm going to ask each of you if you want to make an introductory statement, and then we'll get into the conversation. So, Anna, is it okay if you go first?
Sure, yeah.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me here. I'm really excited to be here and have a conversation with everyone on the panel and in this room. I've been thinking a lot over the last few weeks about this panel discussion and why art matters to me as an artist and maker. And I just want to begin just to acknowledge that I speak today as a settler on this land, and that a lot of my work has been done in remote parts of the Arctic in Canada, and that I hold the stories and the people and places very carefully when I speak about these things. And any story that I tell today has been given to me by the person that I will speak about. And so I just want to start there with that. And I'm very grateful to the people who I've worked with in those spaces. So one of the things that has shaped me in my work is being a queer person, and that I come from and at the world from a place of sometimes feeling left out of spaces and being on the margins. And so when I engage with people, when I meet people, when I work with students, when I think about the kinds of projects that I want to make with art, I'm thinking about people who have been kind of historically left out of places. And that really fuels my creative path to open space for people. My work is shaped by my experiences in Northern Ontario and the Arctic. And I spent years actually guiding canoe trips in the North. And so I started to work in the land, on the land, and in those spaces in a very different way from living in the city. And then as a student, I was actually a student here 20 years ago at the University of Guelph, where I learned printmaking. And I started to take images that I had found in those spaces and come back to the studio and kind of translate them into my experience of being in that landscape, of feeling connected to myself as well in those spaces. And now, 20 years later, have started to develop a print practice that really starts to build space for people to work in community in the print studio. And I think that one of the interesting things that art can do is that it can kind of navigate around issues and enter spaces that other modes of inquiry can't. Like sometimes science doesn't have the ability necessarily to get to the heart of something. And so when I'm thinking about land and landscape, I think sort of like a scientific perspective with glaciers and climate change could be, how do we measure this? And an artist might ask, like, how does a glacier feel in that space, and start to look at things from that perspective, and then bringing arts and science together into those spaces, I think is really interesting. I also think that we're living in really troubling and challenging times, and I think that art matters more now than ever in being able to communicate with people. So I'm very excited to talk more about that and, why art matters today.
Super. Thanks, Anna. John?
Oh, thanks. Art can be thought of at many different levels, from it can be something you do that's very personally fulfilling. It can be relevant to a local community. The particular way I'm interested in it is, I think, at the largest level, art as a kind of a historical human communities practice. In other words, I think of art as the way humanity has tried to show itself what it is. And I pick the word show because I think of art at that biggest level as putting on display things for which we don't have words. So I say, in that sense, show rather than say. And what follows from artistic practice, I think, is gradually learning how to put into words those things that have been demonstrated through works. So that's where I start off thinking about art. It's at that sort of grander kind of cultural level, or level of civilization. And so my interest, as Andrew said, is I'm writing a book right now called To Live in These Times. So the question of contemporary art is quite relevant to me. What is contemporary art? What is going on in our society now, such that in some way our society is showing itself what it is in a way that we might learn from? So that's the question on my mind. I want to just dwell on that word contemporary for a second, though. It seems to me we can take that up in different senses. What does it mean for art to be contemporary? Well, in a way, it would mean that it speaks to us meaningfully. But in that sense, any great work of art, I think, is contemporary, because the reason those things are great is because they have undying significance. I think that's real and very important, and I want to hold on to that. But there's a second sense of contemporary, which would be the works that actually come from our culture, not just the works that can speak to it. And that, I presume, is more what's on people's mind when we talk about contemporary art. But even there, I think there's a distinction that I again want to emphasize. Artists, anybody doesn't just live for a year. People live, for their whole lifetime, for a generation, and they intersect with other generations. And so I think of the contemporary artists I think of, many of them are people who are now quite old. One of the people I'm particularly interested in is Caddy Noland, who in 2023 had a show, very prominent show at one of the Gagosian galleries in New York City, which surely counts as very contemporary, but she's older than I am. So she grew up before the Beatles, and at the time of Elvis Presley and so on. So I think she's very much a contemporary artist. But like me, living in this age, I kind of feel like I'm not part of this world anymore. I certainly am in some sense, but there's a whole generation going on around me that, in a way, I can't quite witness, I can't quite see. And I say that just because I think it's quite an important issue to think about who is in these times and how. In any case, there's a side of contemporary art that particularly interests me in this book I'm working on. I'm looking at these traditions in contemporary art that have contributed to shaping the world we live in right now. But those are people from generations ago. So Caddy Nolan's work, for example, involves pictures of Nixon and Kennedy, and I bet lots of people don't even know who Nixon and Kennedy are anymore. So then I want to bring in a last sense of contemporary art, which I think is quite important. And that is not just work of people within our culture that speaks to issues of our culture, but work that uses as its very material contemporary things. The contemporary culture is its material, unlike John F. Kennedy from generations ago. There I want to say that what I really think is the thing that defines contemporary art from my point of view is that it uses the materials of the contemporary world to put on display to that world what it is. So the relevant materials, it seems to me, are the materials that normally make up something like the instrumental infrastructure of our world. Precisely those things we typically don't notice. And it seems to be truly contemporary art is art that takes those things we use and ignore, whether they're servants, tools, waste, those things are turned into the media of expression by which we can start to learn about ourselves, things we have kept hidden from ourselves. And so that's the last thing I would say. That's what I ultimately want to connect with in contemporary art is the way that it has the capacity to put on display for a culture, or particularly for our culture, the hidden sides of ourselves that ultimately are rather oppressive. And I'm concerned in this work at the ways that contemporary culture does deny many crucial dimensions about human life. And I'm very interested in the way that contemporary art brings to representation those things, those communities, those structures that are occluded or suppressed in our normal ways of living.
Thanks, Don. Lots to circle back to there, I think. Like the tension between timelessness and contemporaneousness in art and the relationship between art and oppression. I think it'd be great for us to talk about those. But first, Amanda, the floor is yours for a couple of minutes.
What they said is what I want to say. No, I think some of what I say will ping with both of you. And I think I just, by way of introduction, wanted to get through some, sort of lay down some concepts and orient my work in there. So I'm a scholar of contemporary art, art history, theory and practice, aesthetics, criticism, and political ecology. And most recently, I would say in the last 7-8 years, I've been thinking and writing about environmental justice in the Inuit territories of the circumpolar north, mostly Greenland, but also Nunavut. And in that regard, I've been collaborating with and writing about Inuit and other Indigenous artists who do performance, film, drawing, and generally working in a multimediatic global forum, I'd say. But I want to speak more about how my work relates to issues of representation and power, since that's the panel. The two terms, I would say, come together in a concept like, now I feel like I'm being a bit boring, but I'm going to recuperate a concept just for the purposes of getting things going. Something like an aesthetic regime, and this is Jacques Ranciere's term, and it connects to sort of earlier concepts like Gramsci's notion of hegemony, Adorno's concept of the schema of mass culture, Clement Greenberg's neo-Kantian modernism. So generally, we perceive and interpret in a regime of common sense that is built on really cornerstones of institutional thinking. But art challenges us to think on alternate terms, to perceive, but also to create experiences that undo the limits of the aesthetic regime, but also to turn back on that regime that generated it in order to read its ideological function. So that's a lot of concepts. But I don't think that they're unfamiliar to anyone. I think they're actually like pretty workable. So I write about the ways that art runs against the grain of the aesthetic regime, which means identifying the terms of representation, so the conditions of possibility of representation, and the artistic strategies by which we can see these terms. Sometimes this is very paradoxical, like staging the unrepresentability or invisibility of peoples, or the invisibility of natural processes, or economic systems, ecosystems, and so forth. In terms of power, I'm working through the concept of authority. So I've got a book on the go called Realism Without Authority, which is to say, thinking about representation, how representation is given force, and visibility or not by way of political authority, whether that's a top-down authority or alternatively by way of collective deliberation. So mine is not so much a question of why art matters as how it matters, say in an aesthetic regime, and to whom. Power creates a lens, an orientation, silos of focus. Art counters these with alternate lenses, attentiveness to styles of perceiving, so bodily perception, and reflections on the conditions of sense, or what we might think of as sense ecologies. Like I have an example because I imagine that Andrew would be like, could you give an example of this? But I think instead I'm just going to there's my little introduction and, and let you redirect.
And then you can ask, is there an example?
Yeah. So this is heady stuff, and I feel that it's at a very high level. It's a very in-depth level, and I want to sort of see if we can sort of find a sort of foothold here in a lot of these ideas that are going around. So an example would be great. I guess maybe we could start out just by several of you have mentioned different forms of oppression and the way in which art relates to that, and I think we've also seen different modes of oppression. So aesthetic oppression, but also political oppression, but also failure to engage with climate change, for example, with environmental concerns. So is art always anti-oppressive? What is the relationship between art and oppression? What role does it play in combating oppression? So I know that's very general, but then we can sort of maybe drill down from there. I'll point at you first, Amanda, but then we'll just sort of.
Okay, so I'm going to give the example that I was going to give. Okay, so I wrote about this. It was a film called One Day in the Life of Noah Pugatuk. Sorry. And this was at the 2019 Venice Biennale, but it was a film that was shown there, but it was also streaming out of Iglulik. And it was made by the film collective IISCI, which is, some people might know the director, Zacharias Kanak, so this is his film collective. So basically, this is one day in the life of this Inuit hunter, but it's not just any day. It's a day in 1961 at the peak of the Cold War. And the film is, it follows this hunter, and it's deliberately slow, and this is to speak to time. In a sense, there's a date here. There's the historicity of this day, but it's also deliberately, and this is Zacharias Kanak's other films as well. It's very slow, and so you have to sink into this day. But then sort of the core of the film is an encounter between this hunter and his hunting party and a government worker who has come to convince them to basically rehouse themselves in a government settlement. And the whole film is the interaction, the communication between the two. So this is a real grappling between the two. And I write about this as a confrontation between two worlds proper. There's two worlds of meaning. And the entire film is about their miscommunication. And it's really, it's quite, at different times the government worker gets he's using violent language. And if you know anything about the Inuit, it's like expressions. There was a book of anthropology called Never in Anger. And it really, for the Inuit, like anger is it's not only toxic, like you'll be cast out. Like you have to get rid of anger. So when this government worker starts getting angry because Pugatuck is like, no, we have everything we need. Why would we go to this government settlement, get an education for our children, learn about money, et cetera, et cetera? Why would we do that? He repeatedly says no, and the government worker gets more and more angry, and the hunting party gets more and more, like they're sort of laughing, but they're also at different times disgusted. And really, I think what is happening there, like there's sort of a formal thing about slowing down time so that we can see this communication, and we can see the mistranslations, we can see the lapses in meaning, we can see that it's two worlds and that they're not meeting. We can see that it's a violence against the Inuit. I mean, we know what happens, right? So this is a 2019 film, but it's reenacting a moment in 1961. To me, what's important about that is that we see these expressions of saying no to the government. So it was never agreed that the Inuit would be resettled. They never agreed. And so we see that in film, and we see it through this exchange. And that's important because the Arctic territories are still being people, Inuit are still being displaced, and there's still resettlement going on, and there's still colonial violence by way of resource extraction, and, something that I've been thinking about a lot recently, Trump, he keeps saying, I'm going to buy Greenland. So that film, and he had done so in 2019, the same year that film was released at the Venice Biennale. So that historical moment becomes, it resonates in an important way with the contemporary moment and sort of the a kind of new settlement of Arctic territory.
Yeah. Awesome. Anna, do you want to pick up on that theme, or enlarge on that example? Did this reveal an oppressive relationship? Did it help to uncover something that was previously concealed, do you think? How does it sort of impact the viewer of that film, would you say?
I haven't seen the film, but from my perspective of that anecdote from it, I think that reveals a lot of what has happened in the North and continues to. And to talk about climate change in the North, the people of the North are going to be the most impacted by what's happening with melting and permafrost, and again, this displacement that happened in the 60s. It is happening again with the choices that the South have made to create pollution and all of the environmental impacts of that today. Yeah.
So, I mean, I guess to me, it could easily feel like, art representation is relevant to that, right? So Trump is, going around, he's making these threats. So he just fired the commander of the U.S. military base yesterday or today. Does art really have the power to do anything meaningful in the face of that kind of oppressive, set of circumstances?
So one of the things that I'm thinking about a lot is the idea of hope in these times, and that I hope that art has that ability. And I'm looking at the writer Rebecca Solnit, who writes about hope in the dark and then It's Not Too Late, changing the face of the climate emergency. And what she writes about is this idea that hope is not blind optimism. It's actually grassroots action that have been taken, small steps where people made change not knowing the outcome. And so I think that with art, I hope that art can be that thing that can be a catalyst for small change. And we might not actually know how that's going to impact things right now, but taking that action through creating film, print, drawing, thinking about things from a different perspective, I think that can create change.
Super. John, I mean, you mentioned the importance of timelessness in art, but is it also responding to a particular moment in that way?
Yeah, yes, but I want to actually, I do want to say yes, but I want to come at it slightly differently, because I think that art makes a huge difference, but it makes a huge difference in the way kindergarten classes and medical care make a difference. Like it's not as if painting a picture is going to make a bullet not go through your heart. But that's not really the level to look at it. So I don't think somebody's going to do some artistic thing that's going to change United States government policy in 2025. But that's not really the issue. The issue is more, what is the role this kind of human practice plays in the shaping and development of human communities and human lives. And so a community, or people who have the opportunity to engage with art, whether through participating in artistic practices or becoming familiar with traditions of artistic work or whatever, those are people whose perspective is shaped and developed through those things. And those are the levels at which it seems to me a different kind of world, different kinds of resources are made possible. So I certainly think there is an issue of art being timely, and that's why, while I certainly think studying, Greek sculpture and Michelangelo remains of primary importance, it makes sense that there are all kinds of things that people are doing in the 2020s that should be on the agenda of study and learning, because they do, in a much more specific way, speak to quite local and quite contemporary issues. So I think in that sense, yes, there is a real matter of the timeliness of art, but it would be a mistake to think, oh, it's a sort of a countermeasure that's going to stop this thing. It's more, to my mind, it's more a matter of a cultural resource that plays a tremendously large role in articulating possibility and contributing to the healthy development of persons. And so I think your language of hope is exactly right. I think, at IISCI, is art always anti-oppressive? In a way, I think yes. I think art is always about a future. It's always about a kind of experience or a kind of perception you don't yet have. And so art is what opens up the doors of possibility, so that you don't just have to live and think according to the terms in which your existing society has constructed things. So that's my sense of the route by which it's going to be relevant.
What do you think, Amanda?
I mean, I had written, okay, I don't believe that art has the effect of, I think that the question was, and this is slightly different from the way it came out, but can art redistribute power? Can it change? What power does it have to change power, or something like that? And I'm like, I don't know that it can redistribute power in this, again, not in the sense of necessarily policy or something like that, but on the level of consciousness and on the level of futurity. So when I think about that particular film and the telling about this confrontation between the hunting party and the government worker, it does have an effect on making us see how a different future might be possible. Mm-hmm. Or, it isn't, we know what happened, but that doesn't mean that the future isn't up for grabs. But it might it also might attune us to the fact that the future is up for grabs, that there's a danger. And I think that it had that way of making us feel, the application of power on land and land-people relationships and that sort of thing. So the telling made a difference in that way. And it doesn't necessarily prescribe the outcome, I guess.
Can I say something more? I mean, I want my son to see that film.
Yeah.
He's 8, and I think that's what's going to matter, is him seeing something like that, as well as whatever he sees on the news or whatever he sees. But I think that's someone for whom that's going to make a difference. And so I think that's a part of I guess that relates to this thing I was saying about how do you belong to the contemporary generation. He belongs to it very differently than I do. And I think that's where one would really want there to be impact on the people who are going to be living in the world.
So how does art do that? So if it's creating, if it's changing people's consciousnesses, if it's revealing new perspectives, what is it about art that does that, as opposed to, if this is genuine opposition, as opposed to science, for example, or as opposed to everyday life? Any one of you, Anna, if you grab that.
Sure. It's a huge question. I think that art you can interact with it in a different way. You can see it in different spaces. You can see it in public galleries. You can see art that's made in the street. And you can, imagine different possibilities. It asks you to do that. And there's not many things that ask you to imagine something differently. With science, I don't think I've been asked to, there's outcomes, and maybe I'm sure there's scientists who would disagree with me, but I think that role of imagination, that an artist creates a piece and then the viewer interacts with that, I think that is very different from something like a scientific analysis of something.
I can think of a couple of things. First of all, I don't think there's any reason why these things need to be set off in opposition as if they were going to be art and the sciences. Of course, there are important differences in the methods of the natural sciences and so on, but I don't exactly start off by thinking of them as competitors. There's something quite profound and important one learns through the natural sciences, which is how to harness the forces of the natural world to do things one wants to do. It can build refrigerators. That's a tremendous accomplishment, So why wouldn't one want to learn how those things work? But surely that's not the only thing one does in life. And so there are many, many other things that go on too. And so one should learn that. But, when people sing songs, skip rope, play games, there are all kinds of other things that are learned. They learn about how their bodies work. They learn about the possibilities for connection with other people that come through those things. So in our department, there's a woman named Rachel Elliott who wrote a dissertation on music in its role in establishing communities. And so, typically you might think of music as nice sounds you like to hear. And maybe that's true, but her point was that's not really what music does. What music does is it produces the situation where people come to experience bonds with other people, but they do it out of bodily practices. They do it out of hearing their voices harmonize and their bodies moving together in dance and so on. So I just pick up on those examples because I think we can think of all kinds of very familiar things that bring out for us rich and potent dimensions of the world that we certainly wouldn't want not to have. But those don't come from a test tube or from learning how to titrate a liquid. Those things are great to do, but they're just in a quite different domain. And it seems to me that artistic practices, what's particularly interesting about them is that they draw our attention insightfully and focusedly to all kinds of dimensions of our experience that can be meaningful. And that's often why they're rich and new. Like say, oh, I never noticed that before. Or, so that's part of the creative dimension of this. And so, in the thing you said about that film, like I really liked your emphasis on it going slowly. Like one of the things I think, it's not unique to that film, I think. It's a thing I've seen sometimes, but that's what happens when you see certain kinds of video works or whatever, like you realize, oh, I'm going to have to sit here for 15 minutes and watch this thing through. And part of the point of that is it attunes you to this thing, to the passage of time and patience and being slow and what can be revealed through that sort of practice. So those things aren't at odds with any truth discovered through physics or chemistry. But they're also, you might learn some of that by titrating a liquid. You learn a lot about patience and so on there too. But the point is these things put on display dimensions of our experience that we can discover to be meaningful by interacting with them. And so I was picking very small level ones, like at the level of our immediate embodiment, but it seems like those are things that happen at many levels, cultural and all the rest. And I think that's part of the unique education and transformation that our works might offer.
Yeah, I was going to say, the screenplay for that film said this is a it's a film about a Pugatuk, but this is really a film about time passing.
Yeah.
This is a frame of time passing, and so that's really important. But the other thing I was thinking, I had the phrase when I was thinking about this panel, knowledge is power, right? But we're in a time when it's the opposite. It's like fake knowledge is power, actually. So where does that leave, in fact, well, I keep saying things like, in fact, but facts themselves, are fake news. And so there's this kind of dissolution of facts. This is a violence against scientific knowledge as well, and it all feels very precarious. But there's a way that art resituates itself in that, and I've been thinking a lot about how art sort of has gravitated towards realism, trying to, but not a kind of scientific realism, but something more like truth to experience. When knowledge isn't power, when in fact fake knowledge is power, or false claims, or power plays, empty power plays. I mean, they do have an effect on the stock market. This is something I'm thinking about, where it seems like, why would you just say stuff like that? It's just awful. But then it can have an effect on the stock market, and then everybody just thinks of it as, cultural fodder, or like everybody's paying attention, but there's nothing really there. It's definitely not knowledge. It's definitely not fact. What is it? But then art resituates itself, and it does sort of drive at, okay, but what is our experience? And so there's a different kind of questioning that still wants to keep an anchor in the world, an anchor in our lives. Definitely, it's like an anchor by way of our bodies and our sense systems. And so this is something that I've been thinking about in relation to representation and power. Like, what is a power play? It's not like a conspicuous display of knowledge necessarily. It might be like an outright refusal of knowledge. So I've been thinking about like the Trump Secretary of Energy, Chris Wright, tweeted recently, "There is no climate crisis, nor are we in the middle of an energy transition." Okay, so it's just like no. But this is the Secretary of Energy of the US, right? So that's a power play. But it's not fact, it's not truth, And so this is where it's like, okay, what can art do? So you'll say, well, Amanda, what can art do? But I'm saying, okay, well, here's the question. It has to resituate itself, I think.
So is there a tension here between, so partly we're talking about art as an expression of culture, right? So it sort of reveals what's going on in our culture. It reflects, the current moment in our culture. But what if our culture is changing in ways that are problematic, right? So you were talking about patience and art helping us to sort of discover patience, but arguably that's not the direction that culture is going right now, and maybe that means that the kind of art that is a reflection of that culture is not going that way. So is there a tension between art as a window into culture and art as something which should be more normative than that has a sort of moral weight to it that shows us how culture should be, as Anna was saying, rather than how it actually is? Can it do both things at once? Anna, what do you think?
I think potentially. I think one of the things I'm thinking about as we're talking about art as if it's an end product. And the act of art can be community-based, and it can be something that is intangible with gathering people together in a space to talk about these issues and opening them up instead of trying to have an answer to it. What would happen if we had a group of 10 people start to unpack and unravel these questions from kind of like what we're doing here from different perspectives? So I think that, thinking about art as an action that can be done together, I think that that's a really interesting place to start to have that dialogue. And I think about that. I did a community art piece called Be Our Ally that was working with rural youth on issues of homophobia, and it was developed by a theater company that uses forum theater to create anti-oppressive plays, and the students who participated in this group, they wrote the play for Be Our Ally, and they participated in the photographs that I took with them. And so it was actually a piece that reflected the people in that room in that moment. And now would be completely different. If we started again with a different group, we'd have a totally different answer for that time. So I think that that's an interesting place to start to look at some of this sort of problematic nature of how do we, unpack these systems of power that are at play, that, we can have different dialogues from different perspectives.
To my mind, art, if it's really art, can't really do the second thing you said, which is adopt a kind of moral stance and try to teach a lesson. Because then it's illustrating an already established thesis or something like that. But it seems to me that being a kind of mirror is nonetheless always in a way going to be critical. If that mirror is putting on display, the tensions that are existent in a situation, but that are not typically recognized in that situation. And it seems to me that is generally the way in which art is able to be critical. But I really think an artwork is more like, I guess I'm imagining. I'm using a visual metaphor, so I'm imagining something visual. But it's more like saying, can't you see? And showing you the picture of yourself, where the idea is you should be able to see there something. And it seems to me that it may well be that the person producing that has certain critical views and so on, just the way somebody conducting a experiment in chemistry has views about what's happening and et cetera, right? So it may well be that that person has moral views and thinks, wow, this is a very oppressive situation. But having that view isn't what makes that thing a work of art. The thing that makes it a work of art is that, to my mind, is that it actually does use the materials to let them show something that they show. So it's more in that case like saying, can't you see this thing that I saw? And it then becomes a way to share a kind of available experience. Let me go back and just mention one thing. I mentioned in my initial remarks this artist, Caddy Noland. She claims, that the United States is a psychopathic culture, which I think is true. And her point is it takes all the things that are in fact valuable and turns them into waste. And that's kind of what her works put on display. They put on display the things we throw away and so on. But the particular point I want to make related to that is that she was doing that for a long time. Now, she was born in 1956, I think. Now, in her show in 2023, a lot of the materials she used in that display are also materials from the 80s and 90s or whatever. Like they're out of date. But it seems to me, in a way, what she's putting on display in doing that is that one of the things that we throw away is our own past. So precisely by not using contemporary materials, she's showing how ignorant we become of our own past. And it seems to be there. All she's doing is taking something you could find, like a video cassette, or there's one with STP oil treatment, hubcaps from an old car, but they're just things. But by putting them on display and surrounding them by certain other things, it seems to be you're in a position to notice something in what was already there that you could have noticed otherwise, but probably didn't. But she's set it up in such a way that you now, if you choose to pay attention, you can now see something about what's going on around you and what you're already doing. She's no doubt doing that because she has herself developed a critical perspective, but you don't need her to tell you what the point of that was. All you have to do is look at the hubcaps in the STP gas treatment. So anyway, so I think art is critical, but not didactic. And I think if it becomes didactic, it's just not art anymore. That was long-winded, I'm sorry.
No, that's good. I think I'm going to, if I may, pick up on some of the dimensions of what you're talking about, going back to sort of art reveals what's hidden or concealed and, what's buried in history. One thing I dislike is sort of like if art is people thinking the political. If it's political, it's somehow you've crossed a boundary. It's not art anymore if it's political or something like that. When really, I think we should just sort of pull apart at that word political. But definitely, I would say yes, art isn't sort of doing the right thing if it's moral. That's not the kind of criticism that we mean. But I do want to, and I have been thinking about what it means for art to be responsible, like responsible representation in a certain way. So in that regard, sort of writing in the context of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, I had a collaboration and wrote about the work of Terence Houle, who's Blood Tribe in southern Alberta, and he did a performance piece, and this is also to speak about like the process of art being really important. He had a commission as part, there was a decommissioned brick factory, and so he was invited to do a work to sort of, as part of converting the brick factory into a kind of heritage museum. He found out that that brick factory had made the bricks for the schools, the residential schools that both of his parents had been to in Manitoba and Saskatchewan. So he actually got hold of some of those bricks and did a performance in the brick factory. There had been a flood in the brick factory. And he turned it was a performance, but also a sound piece. So he used a theremin, which is that device, like in science fiction films, it just sort of stands there and it goes, whoa, 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 whoa. So this was called Ghost Days, If These Bricks Could Talk. And he took a sledgehammer to those bricks. And then the theremin, of course, sort of catching his movements. He's like, I used my indigenous body and made sound. So it was a kind of concert and performance, but it was also a kind of making real of the ghosts that would have been in the bricks that made those schools. So, and keeping in mind, and he always had in mind, like this was, a time, when all these unmarked graves around residential schools were being excavated and there were inquiries as part of the TRC. So it's, this is serious stuff, and it's also a buried history, and it's a bad one. And so Terence Houle turned that, and in a very material way too, into a sound concert, but also it's significant. He's taking a sledgehammer to the bricks. And that I think of as, you could say, well, it's an Indigenous artist, it's political, and, especially with regards to the TRC, that this is some kind of power play, but that's missing the point altogether. There's a kind of responsibility to the truth and to the truth of history and to the truth of, this is not news for Indigenous people. None of it's news. So this is an artwork that kind of captured that and did so in a way that's like, like it's, this is the sound of ghosts, Terence Houle is very playful. But at the same time, it was a very serious performance.
Yeah. So what I'm getting from this is that art, if it's any good, isn't didactic, it's not moralistic, but it's transformative by sort of showing us something back at ourselves. But I guess I wonder is it always progressive? So I guess the theme here is art at power. I guess in the current context, we're thinking about art as a response to various forms of authoritarianism. I mean, does it always do that? Can it be used in the service of authoritarianism? Or is it the very fact that it's art something that is progressive somehow? Any one of you want to grab hold of that?
Oh, I'm just thinking of like how propaganda art was used in World War II. Like I think that art can be used as a tool for oppression, for sure. And I wouldn't say.
I mean, some people might be tempted to say that's not art then, right? But is that arbitrary? Are we just picking and choosing what counts as good art on the basis of a kind of moral judgment?
I think probably. Yeah. Yeah. And I think it depends on how people react to it, because I think there would be lots of people who saw posters of Nazis and thought that that was art, or the way art was destroyed. Like, I think that, I think that is an arbitrary decision in that way.
Yeah, I can't think of I can't believe that there's anything that can't be used for oppressive purposes. If you found it, that would be great, because then we would just use that to get rid of all the bad things. But mathematics can be used for oppressive purposes. Chemistry can be used for oppressive purposes. So, I mean, I think, you get people together who don't quite know what they're doing. You get them to dance, and they have a really good time, and they feel bonded, and you can use that to encourage them to go out and get together and kill somebody. I mean, that's kind of art in dance that's producing something, and you can direct it in a certain way. So of course that can happen in any context. I think the thing that maybe might be worth holding on to there, though, is that it's not as if the impact of the dance or whatever propagandistic thing was used, it's not as if the impact of that could ever have been completely controlled and exhausted by anyone. And that would be true of addition and chemistry too. So anything that you're going to use, of course you can find ways to manipulate that, which is a particularly powerful resource for X, Y, or Z. You can use it to evil ends. But that thing itself is also always going to have effects of its own that you can't control. So if you teach people to read for the sake of getting them to read the thing you want to convince them of, it also means they can read another book, and they might do that sometime. And so anything that seems to me is a power is going to bring into being resources that could go in ways you don't know. But surely art is used manipulatively more all over the place. Every television commercial, every soundtrack on every film you've ever watched, they're all there to manipulate your feelings, to manipulate their perceptions, and surely it is clear they're extremely effective at taking money out of your pocket and putting it in someone else's pocket. So there can't be any doubt about that. But it's also true that theme songs from movies and everything else done in advertising can be educative in a different way. You can learn all kinds of things from them that could send you in other directions too. So I don't think so of course they can be used in those ways, but I don't think they can ever be contained.
What do you think, Amanda?
Yeah, I was just thinking to myself, I find it's a big challenge to think about how like the financialization of art. So not so much like art being co-opted by authoritarian regimes. It's that too, but then there's also, or at least I would say my students are mostly concerned with who's bankrolling artists, or like, what about these artworks that are, worth millions, hundreds of millions of dollars, and is that even art at that point, or is it just a conspicuous display of wealth? And I've been thinking about, and even just how the value of art goes up when this is my specific example. I've been writing about the work of Jean-Michel Basquiat quite a bit, and his representation of boxers in particular, but Bell Hooks has a lovely essay about Basquiat's representation of Black men's bodies and displaying sort of how they are disfigured, how they are dismembered specifically, and remembering Black peoples through dismemberment. So it's a really good deconstructionist analysis of his work, which his work warrants. But she's like, his representation of Black men is always partial, and this is the legacy of slavery, torture. Like, torture wounds are still residual. And it's a wonderful essay, and I am thinking a lot about the sort of how he empowers those bodies, even in and through the wounds, and in and through the recuperation of history. And he has, always that sort of crown that he puts on the head. So there's a kind of sovereignty to these bodies that he's trying to express and capture and deliver through art. The value of Basquiat's work went up significantly upon the murder of George Floyd. So, and then the rise of Black Lives Matter, or the rise in visibility of that movement, which, it's sort of one wonder, it's a little bit troubling. And then exhibitions all over the world that are sponsored by Louis Vuitton. And so there's this kind of so and then I get a sort of student paper that's like, Basquiat is basically a corporate artist. And so is the meaning of that work and what's going on internally to the work and all the kind of thoughts that Bell Hooks has put into it, I'm adding to it, is that all negated by this kind of, new life that it's having in this kind of finance capitalist world? Yeah, now I'm throwing out a question.
So we unfortunately we're out of time. We could go for another hour talking about this. Every answer's suggested 10 more questions.
Are you telling the truth? Is that an hour?
Yeah.
No?
Yeah,
Shocking.
more or less. So, yeah,
We were just
flies
warming
by.
up.
So, thank you so much. This has really been a delightful conversation. I've really learned a lot. I really appreciate you being here. I really appreciate your insights. And it's been great. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
So we do have some more time for audience Q&A. If you guys are happy to sit around and take some questions from the audience, there's a mic there and another mic there. So if anybody has any questions, please come on up.
Thanks very much, all of you, for an enlightening conversation. My name is Andrew Fowles. I'm a part-time MA student here at the university. My supervisor is sitting in the panel.
Andrew.
So at one point you were talking about Mr. Trump and sort of beginning of a joke occurred to me as I was listening. Donald Trump walks into an art gallery. That's the joke. Seriously, I was interested, Professor Russon, in your comments about timelessness, time, and patience. And I wondered if you could say a little bit more about how we navigate a world where patience is a virtue when apparently it's not a virtue at all for many of us.
Yeah, I don't know that I have an answer to how to navigate that, but I can certainly comment on that. I think that's one of the most distinctive things of our contemporary culture is it's built around a kind of denial of the need to take time for things. It's built around the denial of the need to be competent at things. The whole idea of this thing you can pull out and push all the buttons and everything happens for you means you don't need to know anything. And so I really do think that many things in our culture are encouraging that perception. And, it goes along with going to school and thinking, well, there's no reason for me to write an essay. There's no reason for me to go to class. There's no reason for me to buy the books. Very common views. I find those much more commonly present in the classroom now than I used to. So I think it is quite pronouncedly the case in our culture that we have come to interpret our situation in a way that leads us to deny the need for time, for taking time, or perhaps even more the desirability of doing that. So my first remark would just be to agree with you and say, yeah, that's a profound symptom of our contemporary world. And I do think that in all kinds of ways, artworks, maybe even the very notion of art counters that. Artworks, oftentimes people, when they think of art, think they would like to see a pretty picture. And no doubt there are some works of art that are pretty pictures. But to my mind, that has relatively little to do with what art is. And so it's true that art should grab you immediately. That's a valuable thing. But that's really only the start. And it seems to me that if you go, let's take an art gallery, for example. Those might not be the best examples for where to find art, but let's use it anyway. If you go to an art gallery, especially one with contemporary art, you might not see very many pretty pictures. You might not even see pictures. So it could be quite baffling. So I think that it's very much normally the case nowadays, and perhaps always, but certainly nowadays, that if you encounter works of art, you will encounter things that don't cough up their resources immediately. They might, and probably typically should, catch you immediately so that you might want to spend time with them. But it's only by spending time with them that you get things from them. You have to develop a relationship with them. And so again, I don't have an answer to the question how to navigate this, but I do think engagement with art is in many ways the thing that is most opposed to that rhetoric, that dishonest rhetoric of contemporary culture. So that would be one reason why I think artistic culture is particularly potent and important in the contemporary world. And I like this. I want to see this film.
You can.
Yeah, it's good. That's good. It sounds good.
Thanks, John. Other questions? Yeah.
Yeah, I have
John.
a question. John Hacker-Wright, I'm from the Philosophy Department. Really enjoyed this discussion. But it seems to me that the fact that we're having this discussion, it's somewhat symptomatic of the fact that the arts are a little bit embattled in our culture, right? So we're called upon to defend the arts. And one of the ways that happens often that kind of gets my hackles up is defending it in instrumental terms, to say like, well, you'll be healthier or happier somehow if you engage with the arts. And even in this discussion, maybe art was a little bit instrumentalized in terms of its political value. So I guess what I'd like to hear from the panel is some statement about the intrinsic value of art, if you think it has that value.
Who wants to take that?
Can I say one sentence quickly and then I'll pass it? My one sentence quickly is, well, instrumentalism is certainly a real thing. I don't say that saying it contributes to a happy or a healthy life is the same as instrumentalizing it. When you speak of intrinsic value of art, I don't see that that's going to be different from that. So the point about politics seems right, but
Could I?
Okay,
I mean,
and then I'm going to.
I absolutely agree with that, but in a way. But I think the way that it's meant when these kinds of claims appear in the popular press, it's kind of instrumentalized, right? Happier in the sense that you're just. It's not like you're living a richer life. It's just that you're kind of like you feel better. That's kind of what I had in mind. Yeah.
And Amanda, do you want to referee this debate?
I'll do it by turning the question to Anna. I am thinking, I think it's good. I mean, I feel a little bit set up being prompted to talk about the intrinsic value of art as opposed to, what am I sequestering it from, actually. I'm an art historian, so a lot of, art is in my mind 24/7. When 24, no, it is. I actually do think I dream. There's a way in which poetically man dwells, while artistically one lives. Like I just think once art. I think I became very okay. Sorry, Anna. I will turn it to you, but I'm going to answer it. I will think again about about Terence Hoole and the way he told stories. So our collaboration was one in which we were going. We'd have sort of an like Zoom. This was during COVID, and he would tell stories. And he, for example, tell the story of how he was bestowed the sort of title of Buffalo Herder. And always after our conversations, I felt like there's just something about the story that is a cognitive shifter for me. I don't know exactly how, but I think differently about everything. And that, I would say, is as close to like the intrinsic value of art. But note, it's storytelling, and you've got to like that's sort of. That I think in some ways falls into, sort of what I've been doing recently. There's sort of art and the art world, and then there's sort of indigenous knowledge. This is this other domain. And Terence Hoole is somewhere in between, like he's an artist all the time, but he's also a buffalo herder. Yes, I believe that. And so when he tells a story, it's not just a sort of indigenous knowledge keeper telling a story. This is an artist telling a story. But definitely, what that is, I'm like, there's just there's a cognitive shift. I think differently, not just about buffalo, but everything.
I mean, I'm thinking more from an artist perspective and the act of making and the value that brings to a person. And that idea of sort of addressing like wellness, can art make you well? I'm not entirely certain it can make you well, but there is something about focus, slowing down, learning a skill, working in a community space. As a printmaker, a print studio is an open space where people do openly collaborate, share ideas. And there is something really important to gather and work slowly through ideas, and go back to making things by hand in the studio. And that, for me, like when I talk about wellness and art, it is that collaborative process for me that is the important part of creating that wellness together, I think.
I love that answer, Anna. That's great. I think we have time for another question, if anybody has one.
Hi, my name is Emily Bowen. I'm actually studying journalism. And my question pertains kind of to AI art. I know there's a lot of strong opinions about that, especially in the art industry. You were, again, talking about like the creative process and how that's important. But earlier on, you were talking about how people could take wartime propaganda as art. Would you say that AI is a good way to have representation? Like if people want the representation, or do you think representation is more in the creation process and the person who puts it?
Very interesting question.
Could you pose it again? I want to hear the terms, like the last bit.
So
there.
good, you get to ask.
Yeah. I want to just hear where representation is in this, and where AI is and where representation is.
So I want to know your opinions on where the representation comes from in art. So there's AI artists who have the prompt, and then there's artists who actually make it. And where do you think the representation comes from? The actual message or the person putting the message into the art?
Ooh, I think that's really complicated. I think that, I mean, it's such a new field, like thinking about AI, and this comes up in my classes all the time because you can now make an image out of AI before you even start your process of creating. And so I think it really depends. Like, I think it depends on where the sources come from. Like AI takes, from my understanding, it's like pretty minimal understanding. It is sampling from a lot of different sources and not actually citing those sources. So you're kind of out of control of where that image is coming from. And so you might end up taking things from people who, you know, are kind of marginalized or minoritized and creating something that has a meaning that you don't even understand from that. So in my mind, it is like the maker that is important, but at the same time, I know that the world is changing and that AI art is something that we're going to contend with. And there is potential to make, if you can kind of harness that, maybe there is potential for creating meaning from that. I'm not sure. What do you guys think?
I mean, in the theorization of AI, like to me, AI so far, I'm thinking of as a medium. So there's still this dimension of AI that is a black box by which, so even if you're putting in instructions and it produces something, it's still like what we enjoy about it is that something went into a black box and came out as art. So, and we can call that creativity. And that it's just sort of not in the hands of the maker necessarily, but we're enjoying the domain of chance. And that's actually, there's a history of, chance and art and sort of embracing. So I would say AI art still has a genealogy in other practices that, seem to be less, a genealogy in like very much sort of maker's art that becomes more virtualized in this way, but not so different. I don't know. Is it that somebody told me once, somebody that I was TAing for, like the question isn't, is it art, but is it good art? And so my question is sort of, is the AI art good art? Well, what makes it good then? So it might be good if it does sort of embrace that domain of the black box and chance, and therefore sort of what we're talking about, which is creativity and the why of creativity and how that does something good in your life and the lives of others. AI can be that. It can also just be terrible, schematic, or just, or just wrong, or, like I think people are quite interested in the, what is it, the hallucination? That's what it's called, when it invents something? So people like that, but then it can also just be like, that's what makes it funny. I would say it's better comedy than it is art. Not that comedy isn't an art, so, like if we're speaking broadly, but I'll say that somewhat playfully. A little nervously.
I would say, I think that's a misuse of the word art. I think that there couldn't be such a thing as AI art. And we misuse that by confusing art with products that we like to look at. I think that art is the way people try to communicate their experiences to other people. And so if and only if there is a context of people communicating their experience to other people, can there be art. It may well be in that context that someone finds a communicative potential in something produced by a digital computer. And in that case, it's a medium. And an artwork may very well be made out of such a thing, but it's inconceivable that a machine could do that just because it's the wrong kind of thing. It's not people communicating their experience to other people.
Well, it's more like software than a machine. And in that sense, it could be fully integrated into our cognition. And I am not going to be absolute about art in that way.
Okay, on that note, people communicating their experience to other people, I think that's a lovely note to end on. Unfortunately, we're out of time, but thank you so much. This has been very, very interesting.
Thank
It's
you.
very, very good discussion.